Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling bonsai, those cool miniature trees.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. And I got to say, in preparing for this, I really didn't know anything about bonsai, except they look really cool and they're small.
Well, get ready to learn because there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I was reading through all the research you sent over, and it's fascinating. I had no idea. I just thought you started with a tiny seed and somehow made it small.
Well, that would take a really long time.
Right, exactly. But you don't do that, right? You start with already kind of developed trees.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to get bonsai material.
Okay, so walk us through those. Where do bonsai trees even come from?
Well, one way is to take cuttings from mature branches.
Okay,
So you can take like a thick branch from a tree and turn that into a bonsai.
so you're kind of fast-tracking it.
Exactly, you're speeding up the process.
Okay,
Another way is called layering.
yeah.
This is where you encourage roots to grow from a branch that's still attached to the parent tree.
Oh, wow.
And then you can cut it off, and you've already got a nice thick trunk and some low branches.
So it's almost like the tree is giving you a bonsai starter kit.
It is kind of like that.
That's cool. Okay, and can you just buy a bonsai tree, like if you don't want to do all that?
Yeah, of course there are commercial growers that specialize in bonsai,
Okay.
and you can find trees that are already styled to different degrees.
But I imagine there's some caveats with that.
Definitely climate is a big one.
Okay.
You have to make sure that the bonsai you buy can survive in your local climate.
Right, so if you get one from the tropics and you live somewhere cold, that's not going to work out too well.
Not really, no.
Yeah. Okay, so what about just going to a nursery? Can you get bonsai material there?
Yeah, nurseries are great, especially if you're a beginner.
Okay,
They have lots of young trees that are ready to be shaped, and you can choose one that you like.
so lots of options, but maybe not the super, aged look.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're usually young trees.
Okay, so another trade-off there, but there's one more option we haven't talked about, right? And that's actually going out and collecting your own trees,
Yeah, collecting is a really fun way to find bonsai material.
like foraging for bonsai.
Exactly. You're looking for trees that have that weathered look.
I can imagine you finding them, clinging onto the sides of cliffs and things like that.
Yeah, you can find them in all sorts of places.
But I'm assuming there's a lot more to it than just seeing a tree and digging it up.
Yeah, there are permits and landowners to consider.
So you got to do your research.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So now let's say we've got our tree, whether we bought it or grew it or collected it. How do we actually turn it into a bonsai? Like, what's the secret sauce here?
That's where the artistry of bonsai really comes in. It's about shaping the tree to create a specific aesthetic.
And I was looking through the techniques and wow, there's a lot.
There are a lot of different techniques.
Yeah. Some of them seem pretty straightforward and then some were just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it's a whole range.
So let's walk through some of them. Like, where do we even begin with styling a bonsai?
Well, one of the most basic techniques is leaf trimming.
Okay.
You're basically removing leaves or needles to expose the branch structure.
Okay.
And this helps to create those dense pads of foliage.
So it's almost like giving the tree a haircut,
Yeah, in a way it is.
but a very specific haircut.
Exactly. Every cut has a purpose.
Right, okay. And you also mentioned pruning, which is, I guess, more intensive than just trimming the leaves.
Right, with pruning, you're removing or shortening branches to shape the overall silhouette of the tree.
Gotcha. So leaf trimming and pruning are kind of ongoing things you do throughout a tree's life.
Exactly. They're essential for maintaining the bonsai's health and shape.
Okay, but to get those really, crazy cool shapes,
Yeah.
you have to do more than just trim, right?
Right. For more dramatic shaping, we use wiring.
Wiring, so literally wrapping wire around the branches.
Yeah, you use wire to gently bend the branches into the desired position.
It's kind of like giving the tree a skeletal structure.
It is kind of like that.
But how long does it take for the branches to actually stay in that shape?
It depends on the species of tree.
Oh, really?
Deciduous trees usually set within a year, but conifers can take much longer.
Wow, so it's a real test of patience.
It is?
And what if you have a branch that just refuses to bend? Is there a technique for that too?
Yeah, we can use clamping for that.
Clamping,
You use a mechanical device to gradually apply pressure and bend the branch.
Oh, wow. So braces for branches?
You could think of it that way.
So we've got leaf trimming, we've got pruning, we've got wiring, we've got clamping, and then there's grafting too, right?
Yeah, grafting is another technique where you can add branches to a tree.
So like a bonsai enhancement.
Exactly.
And then there was one that seemed really counterintuitive to me, which is defoliation.
Defoliation. Yeah, that one throws people off sometimes.
Yeah, because you're removing leaves to encourage growth.
Right, but it's a way to get smaller, more refined leaves.
So it's like a reset button for the foliage.
You could think of it that way.
And then there were those deadwood techniques that we talked about before the show, and those just blew my mind.
Yeah, deadwood techniques are really fascinating.
Yeah, because you're creating these like miniature sculptures within the living tree.
Exactly. It's about adding age and character to the bonsai.
So how do you even do that?
Well, there are a few different techniques, but two common ones are gin and sherry.
Okay.
Gin is where you remove the bark from a branch to create a deadwood snag, and sherry is where you remove bark from part of the trunk.
So you're essentially like sculpting the deadwood.
Exactly.
That's incredible. And then there's the hedge cutting method, which sounded pretty intense.
Yeah, the hedge cutting method is a bit more aggressive.
So how does that work?
You basically let the tree grow freely and then chop it back hard.
And that encourages denser branching.
Exactly. You repeat that process over and over.
So it's like a bonsai boot camp.
Yeah, kind of.
Wow. So we've talked about a lot of techniques, and it's clear that there's a lot of artistry and skill involved in shaping a bonsai. But of course, it's not just about the styling, right? You have to keep these trees alive and healthy.
Right. Bonsai care is just as important as styling.
Yeah. So in our next segment, let's dive into the world of bonsai care and all the challenges that come with it. So we've covered all these amazing styling techniques, but now let's talk about the day-to-day care of bonsai. Like, how do you actually keep these miniature trees happy and healthy?
Right, because bonsai are still trees. They need the right conditions to thrive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. Like, what are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to caring for bonsai?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the limited root space.
Right. Because they're in these tiny pots.
Exactly. And that means they have less access to water and nutrients.
So you really have to be on top of things.
You do. You have to pay close attention to their needs.
Okay, so let's talk about watering. I imagine that's super important with bonsai.
It is, bonsai soil is designed to drain quickly, so you need to water them frequently.
So it's a constant balancing act to keep the soil moist, but not soggy.
Exactly. And the frequency of watering depends on a lot of factors like the species of tree, the climate, the size of the pot, even the time of year.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Not really. You have to kind of get a feel for it.
I see. And you mentioned earlier that bonsai growers use different containers to manage growth. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so bonsai often go through a progression of containers. They might start in a larger growing box to encourage root development.
Okay, so it's like giving them a head start.
Exactly. And then as they mature, they might be moved to a smaller training box to refine the root system.
And then finally they end up in their bonsai pot.
Right.
That's really interesting. And what about temperature? Like, how do you make sure bonsaiers are protected from extreme weather?
Well, ideally, you want to choose species that are suited to your local climate, but even then, you might need to provide some protection.
Especially during those really hot summers or cold winters.
Exactly. You can use techniques like partial burying mulching or even creating temporary shelters.
So it's all about creating a little microclimate for them.
It is.
And speaking of microclimates, sunlight is super important for bonsai too, right?
Absolutely. Bonsai need adequate sunlight to photosynthesize.
But I imagine it can be tricky to find the right balance, especially if you have limited space.
It can be some species prefer full sun, while others need a bit of shade.
So again, it's about knowing the needs of your specific tree.
Exactly.
And you also mentioned repotting, which is something I don't think a lot of people realize is necessary.
Yeah, repotting is crucial for maintaining a healthy root system.
Because over time, the roots can get really crowded in the pot.
Right. They can become what's called pot bound.
And that's not good.
Not good at all. It restricts water and nutrient uptake.
So repotting is like giving the roots a chance to breathe.
Exactly. You're basically refreshing the soil and giving the roots more space to grow.
And how often do you need to repot?
It depends on the species and age of the tree, but generally every few years.
Okay, so it's another one of those things you have to keep an eye on.
Yeah, bonsai care is all about observation and adjustment.
I see. And I'm guessing there are some specialized tools that make all this easier.
Bonsai tools are designed for specific tasks like pruning, wiring, and root work.
So it's like having a mini toolkit for your mini tree.
Yeah, you could say that.
Cool. And what about soil and fertilization? What kind of nutrients do bonsai need?
Bonsai soil is very different from regular potting soil. It's mostly inorganic material like gravel or volcanic rock.
Okay, so it's more about providing structure and drainage than actual nutrients.
Right, so you need to fertilize regularly to provide those nutrients.
And are there different types of fertilizer you can use?
Yeah, there are organic and chemical fertilizers. You can choose whichever one you prefer.
And again, it's about finding the right balance.
Exactly. Too much fertilizer can be just as harmful as too little.
Right. And of course, you can't forget about pests.
Yeah, pests can be a problem for bonsai, just like any other plant.
So how do you deal with those?
Well, first you need to identify the pest, then you can choose the appropriate treatment.
So it might involve insecticides or other methods?
Right.
Okay, and one last thing before we move on. I think there's a misconception that bonsai are strictly indoor plants.
That's a common misconception. Most bonsai species actually prefer to live outdoors.
Oh, really? So they need fresh air and sunlight just like any other tree.
Exactly. Keeping a bonsai indoors all the time can be detrimental to its health.
So if you're thinking about getting a bonsai, you need to make sure you have a suitable outdoor space for it.
You do, unless you choose a species that's specifically adapted for indoor living.
Okay, good to know. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in terms of bonsai care, and I think it's clear that it's a lot more involved than people might realize.
It's a hands-on hobby that requires patience and attention to detail.
But it's also incredibly rewarding to see your bonsai thrive under your care.
There's a real sense of accomplishment in nurturing these living works of art.
Well said. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up our bonsai journey with some final thoughts and reflections. Well, we've talked about the techniques and the care, and I gotta say, I'm feeling pretty inspired. Like, I want to go out and get a bonsai right now.
Well, I definitely encourage it. It's a really rewarding hobby.
Yeah. But before we wrap up, I want to ask you, like, what do you think it is about bonsai that makes them so special? We've talked about all the technical stuff, but there's something more to it, right?
Yeah, I think it's the combination of art and nature. You're working with living trees, but you're also shaping them, creating something beautiful.
It's like this amazing partnership between humans and nature.
Right. And there's also a philosophical element to bonsai. It teaches you patience and acceptance of imperfection.
Yeah, I can see that it's like a meditation
It
almost.
can be very therapeutic.
So for our listeners who are now like me and want to get into bonsai, what advice would you give them? Like, where should they start?
Well, I always recommend visiting a bonsai exhibit or garden.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Seeing these trees in person is really inspiring.
You can really appreciate the details.
Exactly. And a lot of bonsai societies offer classes and workshops, so you can learn from experienced growers.
That's a good tip. And of course, there are tons of resources online too, right?
Oh, yeah. There's a wealth of information out there. Books, videos, forums, you name it.
So there's really no excuse not to give it a try.
Exactly. Just dive in and see what happens.
And do you have any like final words of wisdom for our aspiring bonsai enthusiasts?
Just be patient and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah, it's a learning process.
It is. And the journey is just as important as the destination.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been a fascinating deep dive into the world of bonsai.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you'll consider giving bonsai a try. It's a truly unique and rewarding hobby. And who knows, maybe you'll create the next bonsai masterpiece.
Maybe you will.
That's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.